Drew, hi, how are you? Welcome to Mapping Ties. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I want to get one thing out of the way, which is a big congratulations to you of passing 200 subscribers for your Let's Talk Communities of Practice newsletter. How does that feel?
Thank you. It's bizarre, frankly, that there are that many people who want to talk about it. So yeah, thank you. I'm very proud of it.
We will link it in the show notes and have our listeners go check out your essays. I really try to keep up with everything you're putting out there. It's very thoughtful and in-depth and interesting. So another great resources for everyone listening. Well, before we kick it off and we go into the weeds of your role, let's start there. Tell us a bit about who you are and how did you end up doing the work you're doing today?
Sure. Okay. Well, my name's Drew, and I lead the Communities of Practice Enablement team at PwC in the UK. My background has mainly been in software testing and various different quality leadership and agile sort of type roles, always working in the tech space really. But this is my first role where I've been solely dedicated to working with communities and communities of practice. But I have over the past 5, 6, 7 years or so been working with and building communities at various different organizational levels and out just for learning communities as well. I suppose I first got into building communities from discovering the first community that really actually meant something to me and spoke to me on a sort of personal level, which was as part of the Ministry of Testing, which is a global, do you recognize Ministry of Testing? Rosie's my hero.
Yes.
Yeah. So many years ago, my first interaction with communities was actually going to one of their test bashes in Manchester. And I found myself surrounded by people who weren't just there doing their jobs and doing a tester because it paid the bill, doing it because they cared about what they were doing. And, and I just felt this is something I need more of this in my life. I need to be more involved in this. In absence of anything going on around me, I thought, well, if I want this, I'm going to have to start it myself. And that's kind of where I first sort of got involved in sort of starting up what I now think of as communities of practice and sort of building from there. And what I find once you have it, you can't do without it. So everywhere I've been building it. But yeah, I've been at PwC now for about 2 years, and I was very lucky to get the role that I'm doing now within our COP enablement team. I described it at the time as my perfect job. So, and I still describe it as my perfect job. So I'm in a happy place.
I love that. And thank you for sharing the origin story and how I love when people start building, like good communities build other communities because members see the value and they go and they kind of are like, okay, I need that somewhere else. And they keep on spreading. And that's a wonderful testament of the Ministry of Testing and how awesome they're doing the things around there. So put us a bit in context, Drew, before we go into your tasks. Tell us a bit about, because I know that you're leading several communities, but there's a bit of a more complex structure there. So give us the context of how many communities are you overlooking, and also how are they structured? Where does your role come into place in that hierarchy or structure? And give us the bird's eye view. Okay,
so we at PwC we have lots and lots of communities. So I reckon at last count it's probably in the hundreds in the sort of, and these are where we put names on things. So these are things that we might call a community of interest, things where people are working with in a certain area or in a certain field of interest where they are passionate and they care about it. As an organization, though, we've put in place firm-wide communities of practice, which the definition we have, they're all technologist-focused communities of practice, but we're open to anybody within the firm who wants to join and wants to be part of them. They are spread across the whole firm. So we have a reach of many thousands of people across the UK. In many cases, we're looking towards our other international members of our network firms as well. So we support 10 firm-wide communities of practice, and those are they were picked out and have continued to be picked out so far as areas that are strategically important to us as a firm and to our people. So areas that we want to develop in. And they fall into 3 types of pools. So things which are specific to a particular type of technology. We might spend time thinking about how we optimize our use of that technology. The practitioners spend time sort of focusing on sort of optimizing and achieving excellence in those areas. We have those which are slightly broader areas. So things like they might spend time rather than focusing on a specific tool for a solution, they might spend time actually thinking about the slightly broader landscape and say, okay, well, how do we solve this problem? What are the right tools for us to be using to solve these problems? What are the right techniques? Those kind of ways. And then we have the broadest sort of communities, and those fall into capabilities. And, that's where all my historical background is, in things like testing and things like agile, things where it is perhaps a more role focused space. And, where we will talk about things like use cases, things like frameworks and those kind of areas as well. Now, all of the communities will do a similar sort of thing, but some will focus on particular activities more because it just kind of suits them that little bit better. One of the things that we do is that all of our communities of practice have a designated lead associated with them. And that lead is what I call a proper job. It's not something that we want people doing side of desk. Or after hours or things like that. They are employed to do those roles. And that might be somewhere between 50 and 100% of their time. When we're looking at those people, I have quite strong opinions on who makes a good community of practice leader. But one of the things that I always say to people is that you don't need to be the expert in your particular area, but you should be an authority and you should have an opinion in it. So that, you should be, so our leads if nothing else, they are respected by the organization. They're respected by the members, but they are designated to lead the community rather than to be an expert in this technology or in this skill set or something like that. Something else we do, which I think is quite important, is that all of our communities have a sponsor from the senior leadership team across the firm. And the sponsor has quite a clear designated role, which is they are there to support and coach the lead, rather than be there to set the agenda, set milestones and targets and things like that. And that, we're quite open and upfront and say, that's not what we need from you. That's not the value you can bring. The value that you bring is helping this agenda be delivered and how they can make it successful across the firm. So yeah, that's a lot of talking about how the structure works. And I haven't actually mentioned how I fit into that as well. So because we're a really big firm, we've got many, many thousands of people based in the UK, tens and tens and tens of thousands around the world. It's very hard to sort of coordinate amongst these different communities, how to do a good job with communities and how to make sure we're serving the needs of our people. So my role and the role of the COP enablement team is we provide a sort of safety blanket and a sort of alignment focus for all of our communities of practice. We say, okay, as PwC, this is what communities look like for us. This is what we want to be doing. This is what we think good looks like. I work with all of our respective COP leads, to make sure they have the tools and the structure and the support that they need to be able to lead their communities effectively. My number one accountability is towards our people and the members of those communities to make sure that they are getting what they need from being part of the communities of practice. But there's also an element of being the inward face to the business as well, in that being there to sort of articulate the value that our communities are collectively bringing, the purpose that we're there for, and how the business can depend on its people, if you like. And when we are trying to democratize the responsibility for what we do to our people and our practitioners, making sure that there is a figurehead who's someone where those messages can go either way into and out of the business. So that's probably a quick review.
So many things to go deeper into. And you mentioned this, that we have a lot of communities, probably in the hundreds. A lot of them are like interest community, but we have picked a number of communities that are strategically important. And already everything you shared about the structure, the fact that every community has a lead and that's not a half-baked role. Those are people that are actually spending a lot of time. Some of them, that's their full-time role. And each community has a sponsor, and then you come on top with your team. It really showcased that this is serious business, right? So let's stay in that area a bit, because you also mentioned that a big part of your role is to translate this value. And in many companies, that is a challenge. It's a challenge where when people are trying to get buy-in initially for a community because they didn't have one, but it's even a challenge after you manage to launch one, and in a year or two, we still struggle to have that translations and prove the value, because it's social learning and it's peer learning, and we know that it's really hard to measure. And so I was wondering, why does PwC nurture this? Why is this such a big program for the company? What is the value that comes out of it? And what are you reporting back to your stakeholders? What do they care to hear? Anything you can share around that would be super useful for us.
Yeah, it's always exciting for me to say this, because I always think of PwC. We are let's make no bones about it. PwC is one of the big four consultancy firm. We provide professional services. Let's not beat around the bush. We are a corporate environment. So when I tell people what I do and that I work for PwC, they're often quite surprised. And it's because at heart, we are a people-based organization, and we care about our people. And when we talk about value, we understand that people are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. And because they're not numbers on a spreadsheet, value is hard to articulate from those people. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's hard to round and say, okay, well, if we do this today, what is the value that this person is going to get out of this over the course of the next month, the next 6 months, the next year, those kind of things. So
very hard to put a number next to it, like on a spreadsheet line.
It is.
If we do this, then that, right? Like that's often hard.
Yeah. And I think as an organization, we're very accepting of that. And, there's a lot of goodwill towards what we do. And I think that comes again from having this involvement of sort of senior leadership sponsorship, that everyone kind of knows what we're about. We know what we're for and what we're doing. But, there's a limit, isn't there? We live it, we can't all just live in a world of like sunshine and rainbows like I do. We have to, sometimes there is an element that, okay, but what actually is it that you're doing here? What is it that you're doing? We use a slightly modified version of Beverly and Etienne Wenger Trainer's value model. And the reason we did it is for those who are not familiar, I'm going to overstretch myself by trying to explain it.
Go for it.
But they talk about a value framework that they do as part of social learning, which is something else I'm quite passionate about. And they talk about 8 different types of value, which are immediate value, potential value, applied value, and realized value. And then around that, they have, I'm going to struggle here, orienting value, transformative value, strategic value, and aligning value, I think. So if I got that right, I'm impressed with myself.
I just opened the notes where I have a screenshot of them.
Have you got it? I've got the book, but I didn't open it. I thought I'd get away with it. Anyway.
Yes.
So we find that although it makes sense, and it's always clear when you understand the source topic, if you are a casual observer who's not quite as interested in perhaps you and I are in the subject, we found that actually it can be a little bit difficult and a little bit hard to access. So we use a slightly modified version, and we focus on the 4 central ones. So the immediate, potential, applied, and realized. And that's how we talk about the value that we do. So if we do one of those sessions where people come along and they talk and they just have a nice time, there is value in doing that, but it's quite hard to pinpoint on what that specific value is, or even when we're going to see the return on that. If, you and I forget how we met actually, Anna Maria. I think we sort of came across each other on LinkedIn at some point. Yeah. At some point I read your LinkedIn profile and thought, oh, you sound like a cool person to know. And, however many months later, now we're here. So something's come from that. But at the time, it's quite difficult to articulate what that value is. So we kind of talk about it like that. And by putting that bit in front of people and saying, this is value, this is something you can see and you can touch and is tangible now because we've made it tangible. There's an element of trust for those other four, the aligning, strategic, transformative, and orienting. Thank you. Yeah, those are the ones that we can focus on. And that's when I think me and my team kind of focus and say, this is what we provide, and we help provide, help give you those sort of strategic and aligning and orienting values so that you can go and do your best work. So that's kind of how we talk about it.
Yeah. Fascinating how in the example that you gave with it, how the two of us came to kind of cross paths, and many months later, here we are creating value for one another, right? So we're having a conversation, I'm learning from you, and we're surfacing the story for the Mapping Test listeners. And so it's interesting how the value from a community of practice you can see ripples of that in time. And very often it's hard for people to go back and be like, I don't remember where I actually read about this or heard about this for the first time, but now I've suddenly applied it in my job and it's been really helpful for me to achieve XYZ outcome. And I wonder, so are you collecting data? Are you looking at data? Are you looking at numbers, surveys, interviews? And I know that with Etienne and Bev, they talk a lot about stories, which is kind of the currency, right, of communities, how they say it. And it's and the challenges that collecting stories often has within the companies, and how do we transmit them forward? Do you work on that level? Are you looking at number? How do you capture this immediate potential applied value? What does that look like?
I think the short answer is no. The slightly longer version is that I have developed over the years some very strong views on metrics and what the right things to measure and what the wrong things to measure are. And one of the things that I always will strongly push back against is counting the number of members as an effective metric, because I'm kind of the opinion that if you run a community meetup, some of our communities, for example, have maybe a dozen members, if that. Some of them have many thousands of members. And I kind of think, well, we can't compare this one to this one because they're completely different. And because one has thousands and thousands of members doesn't necessarily mean it's providing more value than this one. In my mind, there is an element to say, okay, well, as a community of practice, if you want to influence your craft and your people and get better at what you're doing, there is a critical mass of the number of people. So if if that small number is not representative of the whole, I would question whether you're able to actually be an authority and influence in those kind of areas. But at the same time, if I run a community session and I mandate that I want 5,000 people to turn up because I want it to look good, I've arguably wasted 4,950 of people's time because they're not going to engage with it at that level. So, there is a difficult balance when it comes to talking about numbers. I like to take other people's good ideas and sort of bend them a bit to the way I like. So one of the things that we do is I've always been very fond of Emily Webber's maturity assessment framework that she uses. And it's a method that we use quite a lot, which is we sort of run through that every sort of 6 months or so. We say to our COP leads, don't worry about what it's saying about you or what you think it's saying about you, because I assure you that it's not. What it is it's giving us a sort of snapshot in time. And that that snapshot is going to be impacted by many things. So you might have seen, what you might have seen over the course of 6 months is that, some key members of your community have left the business and you're no longer able to do the things that you could do 6 months because those key members have moved on. And that's okay, because we're not saying, well, you're doing a bad job then because you're not doing that. What we're saying is this is where we are now. And what we encourage our community of practice leads to do is to talk to their sponsors and say, this is where we are, these are challenges we're facing, and get their input on, say, okay, well, this is how you might be able to overcome that. Have you thought about doing this? And we encourage them to share that with the community as well and say, okay, well, these are the things that we've lost in the past 6 months, or these are the things we've gained. This is how we're going to take advantage of that. This is what we'd like to do. Who wants to be involved in help leading that? And kind of democratize the leadership against those kind of actions. It's not metrics and in the traditional sense, but it's more, to me, it's more useful, if you like. So that's kind of the approach that we take when we're talking about measuring.
Yes, I recall that, and this is the last, because we could talk about measuring and impact. The whole conversation, there's so much to turn it, and so much that we don't know, and that we kind of have to talk about to wrap our heads around that. I remember some conversations that I was having with Sophie and with Deborah from Moss around this value and impact, etc. And they depend on from community to community and what their purpose are or the purpose is. But they were talking about this option possibility that they were looking into to. So obviously, I don't know, I assume it's the same in your case. Communities are not mandatory, right? So people can opt in to be part of the community, right? And so if you have one of your communities is specifically around this tool or this software or this product, and the purpose is to find ways to get better at using that product or be more efficient in the way that software tool is being implemented, used, etc. There's this, if you want to go really like deep into it and have the resources to do so, you might want to look at what are the numbers in terms of that software usage, impact, time to whatever, etc., of people that are part of the community of practice compared to their colleagues who are not part of the community of practice, and try to see if there's any type of correlation. Obviously, there's there's no causality there, right? That you're in the community, ergo you are doing a better job at using the tool. But it might open up some sort of potential conversation with the sponsor, with upper leadership on the potential impact of a community if there is some interesting trends emerging from there. I know that there are communities of practice around customer support. So are our colleagues that are part of a community of practice engaging in discussing best practices and case studies and ways and tactics to become better at their roles? Are they actually having better performance numbers than their colleagues that are not part of a community of practice? And again, it's very hard to say that it is because of the community of practice, because we cannot isolate that effect. But that's when I said number, I meant more that type of, are we looking at, and that's harder if you say, oh, we are a community for agile practitioners, that's harder to do, but especially if it's like for a specific role that has very specific KPIs and OKRs that are already being measured as part of their role, that might be an interesting deep dive for us practitioners to do just for the sake of it, if you like crunching numbers and kind of have a look at that in detail.
Yeah, I don't deny that would be really interesting, and but I think I tend to draw back from that because I perhaps would like to think of it in a different way and think that I think it's a blessing and a curse being an organization as large as we are. Our size is very much our superpower, if you like, that we can do things and we can support things in a way that you simply can't when there is such a small number with high dependencies on every individual. What works for us, and I've often found is quite important, is where instead of focusing on the individual, you might think about this sort of collective social memory and the sort of social governance that comes alongside that. And it's rather than focusing on perhaps one individual and say, if this person is part of this community, then they get better and better and better and better at something, because by doing that, you're sort of concentrating your expertise into individuals, which you don't really want to do. What you want to do is you want to have this collective uplift of capability and understanding and so well-being, really, that everybody is sort of happy and sort of coming together and sort of understanding subjects together collectively and sort of retaining that information. Because obviously the worst case scenario for any organization, let's be honest, is you have someone, you invest time in training them and supporting them and helping them grow, and then they leave and you lose all of that because you've invested it all in one person and then they go. What we would try and promote is we would say, okay, well, if you go off and you train and you do something and you learn something cool, come and share it, come and share it with the community, make sure that other people have access to that knowledge that you've gathered. And then if you do decide to go off, you go with our blessing, if you like. We're happy that you're moving on with your career because we've still got that sort of retained knowledge and memory that we've got from what we learned from you. You've contributed rather than sort of retained and extracted from that group. So that's perhaps the way I would prefer to look at it and say, okay, well, rather than concentrating on the individual uplift of each individual, think about what this is collectively doing for our organization.
I love it. And so if we were to think about that, obviously you're overlooking, I think you said about 10 communities together with your team, etc. What would you if you look at them 10, what would you actually see to make you say that XYZ community is doing this thing really, really well, whereas a BC community, we still have to work on it because we don't, like, how do we know that this collective uplift is happening in our communities in order to, celebrate them? Or where do we know, where can we find the breaking point so we can support our community leads to nurture that or foster that?
So to my mind is two things. So the way you do it is through trust, and you trust individuals to do the right thing. And you trust that if you give people who are striving towards getting better and developing and learning, trust them and listen to them and sort of support them in terms of growth. What you see in terms of the outputs is always quality. From an organizational point of view, quality is always relative to who, it's in the eye of the beholder. Quality might be you see better software delivered. You might see better customer outcomes. You might see just generally people are happier about doing their job. But those are the outcomes, and those are things that you can measure. They're not necessarily entirely the result or the consequence of strong communities of practice, but they're always better when you have them, because people are, knowledge maintenance and capability and growth is always more resilient when you have them than when you don't.
Yeah, but so that's exactly the type of exploration, if you will, that we're often trying to make. We didn't have a community in X department, field, etc. Now we have a community. It's 2 years later, and here's what we observed in terms of what is it actually doing? Like, why is it there? And so I really like how you talked about, and you can look at it from, there's many individuals that together uplift the department, or it can be like, I don't want to look at any individual numbers. I just want to look at the numbers of the department, or the numbers of the software, the numbers of the output, where us coming together to nurture and hone a craft, a skill, a domain, a practice will hopefully have an impact in real life, in our work, right?
Yeah. I think you've got to remember, I mean, in my opinion anyway, whether you embrace or prohibit communities of practice within an organization or not, it happens anyway, because humans seek, just by default seek connection with other people and seek, like-minded people who they enjoy being around because they share the same values. So whether you're whether as an organization you lean into this or not is kind of irrelevant, because it's going to happen. I think, to my mind at least, the only difference is that if you support them, if you support your people and your communities in that way, they go further and they're more impactful and influential than if you don't, because people will just seek to be around people who think like them. So whether you do it or not, it's going to happen anyway. So you may as well embrace it.
Yes. This is a perfect segue to my next question, Drew, which is this. You and your team, which is called Community Practice Enablement team, Tell us a bit about that role. Who's that team? What are they doing? What are their roles? Because and then the link to the sponsor, because I do understand, and you also mentioned that the sponsor plays a pretty important role in supporting the community leaders thrive in their role. So they often seek mentorship from the sponsor, they seek support, they seek ideas, tips, etc. when they struggle with a challenge. So I often see is that we have the community of practice enablement team. We have the sponsor, which is really strong. It sounds to me like a very important role in that ecosystem. And then we have the community lead, that is the operational part, on the job, the face of the community, the person driving that strategy, actually driving it forward with the community. So what can you tell us about that triangle? How do they overlap? Who does what? Like, what are the dynamics there?
Yeah, so my relationship with the individual COP sponsors is fairly light touch. I think that that's the sort of thing, if I'm involved, I'm getting in the way, so I shall get out of the way, that kind of thing. That kind of exists more so between the lead and the sponsor as a direct relationship, rather than necessarily involving myself or my team. Where we kind of get involved is I will often describe communities of practice in the particular way that we use them as the vehicle to deliver, to get things out into the business. So what me and my team are often finding ourselves doing is we will talk to senior leadership around the business, or people who have something that they want to share or want to push out and contribute to that sort of shared memory and collective knowledge, and putting them in touch with the right people in the communities and making sure they're talking to the right people. They've got the support to deliver and they've got the tools they need to succeed. So I like to think of what I do as more of a coaching role and a sort of coaching and leadership type activity, rather than necessarily getting involved in the practical side of things. Because like I said to you before, we have all these different communities, and as much as I'd love to be, I can't be an expert in all of those particular domains. And for them, well, I'd like to think in some of them maybe, but not in all of them. I can't necessarily be the authority in those areas. So my role is very much making sure that the lead has all the tools they need to succeed, and making sure that they're supported to go and do what it is they need to do. We do tend to provide sort of alignment activities as well, and provide that sort of collective leadership that we do. So something that has always been very important to me is actually spending time together as a group. And I was very keen when I joined the organization that I wanted to make sure that we as a group of leads felt we were together and supported and a community amongst ourselves. So we do regular in-person events for all of it, because we have many offices across the UK. So we're actually quite, as an organization, even if we're all in the office, we're not in the same office, we're all distributed. And so it's important for me that we do these things in person so that we can build these sort of close relationships together as a group and as a team, so that we can learn about each other and what's going on in our particular domain space, what the challenges we're having, the solutions that we're finding, because we all find that we're doing the sort of the same but different in terms of what we're doing, and we're coming up against the same problems just in a slightly different shape. So there's always something that we can learn from each other, and this sort of cross community pollination we find is really, really useful. And we're actually looking at how we can do more of that at the individual community level, and say, okay, well, what can this community learn from this one? So yeah, that's, I don't know if that really answered your question, but
that did. Yeah. So just to sum up, and you'd give like thumbs up, you got it, or you have the community leads, and they're the operational part. They are the ones actually making sure stuff gets done, and the community members are coming together and they're convening and they're learning and they're doing, the activities, improving their practice. They have a very strong connection to their sponsor, and that connection and support is mainly specific to the domain. So that sponsor is really someone that understands what those people are talking about, and they're able to provide support in very specific, domain-specific related questions. Whereas the Community of Practice Enablement team gathers the community leads to align, discuss strategy, challenges, approaches from a community of practice point of view. So it's almost as if your domain, the domain that you're operating under, is that of a community of practice leader. And
Yep.
you're in charge of making sure that they keep on skilling and learning and getting better at the role as the community of practice leader. That's your domain. Whereas the sponsor and everything they're doing on the ground, that's for their specific domain. Software, agile competencies, whatever, whatnot. Is that a good assessment of
that's
what you
perfect.
said?
That's
Sweet.
exactly it. Yeah.
All right. Now let's get a bit into the weeds. I know that you're not very operational. You have a very big team and there's a big structure there. But I know that also our listeners are constantly looking for ideas of activities and to learn about what are your communities actually doing. And the reason we ask this question to all of our guests is I think when you start building community, there's the easiest thing to do is to find some experts that can come for an hour to talk on top of some slides around the specific topic and everyone in the room listens. And those are the famous webinars, and that's the easy way in. And that's usually a lot of communities that are just starting and they haven't found their way around. They function around that sage on the stage format. And what we're hoping to do with Mapping Ties is to really find out what are other ways in which people come together to learn from one another and truly share in the peer and social learning sense. So do you have some examples for us, Drew, of some activities, some what keeps your communities busy? What are they doing?
Yeah, sure. So one, I will just call out first because otherwise I'm going to sound quite dismissive of that. I've not heard Sage on a stage before, but I like that. I'm going to copy that. They absolutely have value. And that sort of transactional exercise where you go, you learn something from somebody else. That is always very useful because that's how we learn. That's, as not just as human beings, that's how all higher mammals learn. It's that transactional passage of knowledge, and that's really, really important. But there's so much more to it. So I know we were speaking about it a little bit earlier, and I hate to name drop here, but we were last week I was at the Communities of Practice Summit in Sesimbra in Portugal, and one of the phrases that I heard discussed at the summit, which I know it's one of those things you hear it and it's going to stick with you you're going to be saying it a lot for the rest of the year, was when they're researching these kind of things, what they're finding is that it's not the training that's value, it's the social learning that goes alongside around the training that people remember and take value from. So those are the kind of things that I would always encourage anybody who's starting up a community to be thinking about. And that's where the real leadership comes in. And those sorts of interactions only really occur if people actually feel like they belong and they care about being part of a group. Because if all I'm going to do is sit in a room and listen to somebody talk and then go back to whatever it is I'm doing, I may as well have just sat at my desk with my headphones on and dialed into it. I'm not getting that enriching experience around it. So anywhere I go, whenever I talk about communities of practice or getting started and getting off the ground, the first thing I tell people to think about is you want people to feel like they are part, start building those sort of relationships and nodes in their own network amongst that group and decide whether this is a group of people I feel like I am part of, whether their values align with my values, and whether I feel part of that. So sessions where we get to know each other are really, really fundamental, particularly in the early stages and from sort of ongoing maintenance aspects of those relationships. So we all know like the cheesy icebreaker kind of things, and we try and avoid them because nobody likes doing that. But things like experiential learning exercises where people come together and they learn through play with, doing stuff with their hands, things where people are actually learning together are really, really valuable. And those are the things that we remember when we think about what did we do at this learning experience. We remember the thing that where we laughed together and we did something that was fun and enjoyable. And that's how we get to know each other as people and as professionals and as practitioners in these areas. I am always a fan because of that, of making sure that you have your sort of serious sort of upskilling type exercises where you go off and you learn in that transactional basis that we talked about, where you have practical hands-on demonstrations where you've got something in your hand that you can touch and you can play with, you can work with. I'm always in favor of just social activities, things where you might not even be talking about work. Or whatever the focus of that community of practice might be, you might just be doing something that's fun, because that's the thing that nurtures those networks, and that's the enabling thing for all the other good stuff to happen as well. So that's kind of my, I don't know if that was too theoretical for your answer, but that would be my answer for it.
That was awesome. Yeah, so I hear this combination, and that is actually, we learn in different stages, and sometimes we need an expert to pass on information, whether that expert is someone that sits in the room, whether that expert is someone that is invited a guest at a podcast or has a YouTube video, etc., or wrote an article or a blog post. It doesn't matter how that conversation reaches you. Sometimes we need to sit down and be like, okay, has anyone else done this thing before me? So I do not have to reinvent the wheel. And then once you have that bits and pieces of information, we go out into the world and we practice it. We practice and we try and we test and we apply to our context, and we see, this worked, that didn't work, this is different, etc. And then we get more questions, and then we go back to the experts. And sometimes we sit to make sense of the stuff with peers. So it's mainly in this kind of mix that learning happens, because it has different facets. And sometimes we need to reflect and learn from what we've done, like from our practice. And other times we're missing puzzle pieces of knowledge where we need to tap into expertise. And it's this constant kind of cycle. So spot on answer for that one, Drew. Now, I know that you've mentioned this, you're a big fan of doing things that have probably nothing to do with the domain. And I know that you've been thinking and writing as well about community culture and how that, like, what is it and how does it manifest, and how do we even think about culture in community, and how do we work with that? And that's a fascinating topic, because I always think that building communities within an organization, it's a hard nut to crack at times, because communities have their microculture, or they develop their microculture as a community, but they're also part of the wider company culture. And at times that wider company culture is very beneficial, it's very supportive and very nurturing, and it boosts a community type of gathering. And in many instances, it rubs against it. And so it kind of challenges the community culture that it's trying to somehow be like, okay, no, let's do it. We can do it, right? So what can you tell us about this term? Where's your head at? Like, how come you're exploring this? And
I suppose I like to explore it. And the reason that it fascinates me is because it's something that's so fundamental to my own experiences into how I started to grow as a professional. And I'll sort of call back to that sort of first experience that I mentioned with alongside the Ministry of Testing. It was the first time that I actually felt like, even though I didn't know anybody, I felt like I belonged in that space with there were people who felt the same as I do and cared about the same things that I did, and I just wanted to be part of it. And that was kind of my introduction into wanting to think about getting better at what I do. And I always think that it's something that all communities of practice, be they organizational, be they in a purely like enjoyment based space or whatever they might be, there is an element of belonging that comes with that I belong as part of this group because I think alike with the people who are part of it. So that is something that I write about, because as a leader, I think it is one of the most fundamental responsibilities that you have is to protect that culture and nurture it and develop it and revere it, if you like. There's a very good book which I recommend in pretty much every conversation I ever have with anybody, so I'm going to do it now as well, is by someone called Owen Eastwood, and it's called Belonging. And he talks about this concept of an us story. So he sort of relates back to something in his own experiences, that he's of Maori descent. His father was a New Zealand Maori. They had emigrated and his father died when he was quite young. And he'd found the tribe in New Zealand that he came from. And he wrote to them and said, can you, I don't know anything about my history. Is there anything you can tell me? And they wrote back to him with essentially a family tree going back hundreds and hundreds of generations, just with the header saying, you belong here. And I think that's so powerful, isn't it? That you can be part of something that's ongoing. And what I've taken from that is that as a leader or any member of a community or any community of practice, you kind of have a responsibility to both those who are there now, but also those who were there before in their hard work, and also those who are going to come after you as well. Because at some point, you're not going to want to be part of that community anymore. The reason that you wanted to be part of it, the need that brought you here will be met and be satisfied. That's okay, by the way. That means that it's worked well and that, it's done its job. So we should have no shame in that. But your responsibility is that you are doing something so that those who join it later on have a better experience and want to be part and are better for the effort that you've put into it, that you are contributing to the ongoing culture of that group. And it's a complex balance from a leadership point of view to say, this is what we hold sacred. These are our rituals that we perform. These are the things that we do as a group that mean something to us, without excluding new views to the group. And it is a delicate balance, and saying, okay, well, you don't want to say to someone, well, you can't be part of our group because you're not like this. You need to be open and inclusive without damaging that sort of community culture that builds up around it. So I think that's why it's so fascinating, is because it's such a deep rabbit hole that goes, and it just plugs into my brain and I can't get enough talking about it.
I know.
I think, it's because I don't know the answer. That's why I'm interested.
That's why it's important to talk about things we don't know much about, because by talking and sense making and kind of pooling ideas, insights, impressions from others is where that puzzle gets kind of, completed. And we could talk about this. Maybe we'll record another episode purely on this topic too.
Maybe. Yeah, that would be fun.
Curiosity here is, though, is this culture something that rather emerges and has to be kind of collectively kept? Or is it something that community leads or core teams of communities can intentionally design? Does it happen, or is it by design, or is it somewhere in the middle? Or where do you stand? What's your brain doing with this?
I think the answer is both yes and no. So I say no, in the sense that if you and I, let's say tomorrow, you and I decided we were going to start a community about books. Because I can see books behind you. I've got a stack of books here as well. So we want to talk about books. We want to get better at learning about books and finding books. So we put out a message to our respective networks and say, do you want to come and join our new community of practice? We're going to focus on learning through reading. People are going to turn up to that. If on day one, we say, we believe that we only want to read books with red covers, and that is our culture, we read books with red covers, everyone's just going to get up and leave, because, we miss out on so much more richness if we just say, we have decided that we are going to impose our values and our beliefs of what is right and wrong and what is good on that community. So to that extent, no, it shouldn't be the lead's responsibility to do that. What it should be is their job is to help the community discover what its values are and what it believes and what its culture is, and then help put the guardrails around that so that the group can respect and revere its culture and let it grow and develop and evolve over time. But it shouldn't necessarily be that you are imposing your beliefs on somebody else as a leader. You are there to help that collectively discover what their culture is.
Made me think, and I had to go look for the reference because I couldn't remember it by heart, but made me think of this, the Macmillan and Chavez 86 studies on fostering a sense of communities and kind of the elements that they discovered, and how one of them is this: in order to create a sense of community leaders or communities in general members should feel that they are empowered to influence. And they mentioned how important it is for that empowerment to influence to happen both ways, meaning the members of the group, the members of the community should feel empowered to have influence over what the community does, like be able to, okay, I have something to say here. I'm valued. My voice matters. I can contribute to this conversation and I'm being heard. But at the same time, the group cohesiveness depends on the group having some influence over its members. So over time, there is some sort of almost like third entity, or how do you want to call it? Besides the people, it's a third entity of the community or the group that kind of holds it together.
Yeah.
So it's this fine balance in between I can influence and impact, because otherwise I wouldn't be motivated to be here if I can't speak up, if I can't shape this, if I can't bring in my juice to the conversation. But at the same time, there would be no community and no cohesiveness if everyone suddenly starts imposing and doing and influencing. So is that, how do we do that?
Yeah.
And that's why I like how Phil always says, Phil Wright is, community is an art, right? It's more art than it is science. So I always cite him on that.
Yeah. I always think if you have your community and you have your culture, a piece of you is part of that culture, and and each individual piece is part of every other person in that community culture. It shouldn't all be one person who is setting that. So yeah, you're quite right there.
Good things. Well, we're almost at the end, but I do have 2 more questions for you, Drew. I'm very curious. Speaking of Phil and Etienne and Bev, which we talked about we've mentioned them quite a lot today, is you just returned from the Community of Practice Summit. You've mentioned that. And I'm very curious to know, well, you spent a couple of days immersed with bright minds, practitioners in our world. What is a thought that it's still lingering after all those good conversations and explorations? Something that really stuck with you?
Yeah, so I think the things that stuck with me. So yeah, so for those who are not familiar with it, so Beverly and Etienne Vengatrainer run a series of retreats at the Social Learning Lab in Sesimbra in Portugal, and the one that I've recently just got back, well, because I know you were at one just before I was there, but the one I was the Communities of Practice Summit, and it's practitioners from all over the world in different domain spaces who come together, and we kind of talk about the state of the nation, if you like, and we sort of learn from each other about the challenges we're having, the sort of real sort of global challenges or opportunities that we're seeing. So I suppose the thing that really came out of it for me was there was a lot of talk about generative AI and artificial intelligence and what that means for people, if you like, because we look at some of the capabilities of what generative AI has at the moment, and you think, okay, well, what does that mean for me? How is that going to impact me as a professional, as a person, as a human? What is going to change for me? And I forget who it was who said it, but somebody used this when we talked about this a lot, and somebody used the phrase that the future is human. And what I think I took away from it was, how do we go about using the generative AI tooling to help us get better at the things that we are exceptional and we are special for, rather than what can we replace by using generative AI tools? So, how do we add rather than subtract from what it is? And I think that's something that, I came away feeling quite strongly about, and how we do. So yeah, I think that's probably the big thing that I took away from it.
I have to plug in here. Are you experimenting in some sort of way already with AI at work in any shapes or forms?
Might be.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
have fun with that. Maybe we share notes some other time and maybe off the record. Last question, Drew. What is your recommendation or advice for someone that's, just at the beginning of the journey and then thinking this community building world looks pretty good. I want to get to it. I want to give it a try. Where does one start build a career, let's say, in communities of practice?
I think getting started is always the most difficult thing. And I know it's a bit cliche to say every journey starts with a single step, but it really does. And I think there is an element of bravery that you have to put yourself out there to say, does anybody else feel like this too? Or is anybody else here? So I often refer to it as a spark of inspiration that somebody has inside them, that there is a need that is not being met by where I am right now. And somebody needs to be brave enough to say, does anybody else feel like this? And that's the point where invariably there's half a dozen other people who go, yeah, actually I do. Because we're never alone. We're all a product of our environments and around us. And, sometimes all it takes is somebody to take that first budding leadership step and say, does anybody else feel like this? and that's where these communities grow from. I would say to anybody who's just starting out with a community is go and be brave and get things wrong. Go and try things that don't work. Go and work out what it is that is going to work for you and for other people. And, always keep in mind that what you're doing should make you happy and you should be enriched from doing those things. So, and if you don't, you're either doing something wrong or it's just not the right thing for you. And it's okay to walk away from it if that's not for you. Don't enter into career in working with communities because you think that it's an opportunity for you to, end up ruling the world in any sort of.
Although you might.
You might. But, that's not why you're coming out to start, is it? You're coming out because you want to make a difference in some way, and you want things to be, you want to change something for the better. And that is, I think that's the most important thing to remember in terms of success is that, do you feel like the work you're doing is making things better? And you can keep stepping on from that and read. You ever want to be good at something, you should read. So.
I love that. Well, I already mentioned your newsletter. We'll link that in the show notes. That's a great place to start for anyone listening that thinks communities of practice are awesome, because they are, and you might accidentally end up really ruling the world. You never know. Drew, it was a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you for generously sharing and spending an hour with Mapping Ties. I'll chat with you soon.
Lovely. Thank you for having me.